This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
Should, in theory, be subject to some pretty significant penalties being imposed by the Government of Canada. But the Government of Canada finds itself reluctant to impose any penalties because a significant cause for the delay were the actions of the Department of National Defence in requesting new equipment. So the two parties, the Government of Canada and Sikorsky, are now staring at each other, almost playing a game of chicken. Sikorsky threatened with the possibility of penalties, but the Government of Canada threatened with the possibility of a massive lawsuit. And still, no helicopters have been delivered. It's in this circumstance that Stuart Webb and myself have not only chronicled this sad history of this failed delivery, the worst procurement in the history of Canada, to quote Defence Minister Peter MacKay. We've not only chronicled that sad history, but we've also made some specific recommendations as to how the Government of Canada could begin to clean up this mess. The first recommendation, very simple, is that the government provide full transparency on this file so that the public can judge the appropriateness of any approach to dealing with the crisis. Our second recommendation is that the government get tough with Sikorsky regarding the overdue and over-budget CH-148 Cyclone by actually imposing the late penalties and refusing further top-up funding. Now, we realize that Sikorsky may threaten a lawsuit, and we feel that Canada should therefore play other cards that it has at its disposal. And this leads to our recommendation 3, that the government commence an accelerated review of off-the-shelf alternatives without further delay, so as to be in a position to negotiate a new contract with another supplier in the event of a continued failure by Sikorsky to fulfill its obligations. We don't like having to make this recommendation, but there's an urgency, an emergency here to replace 50-year-old Sea Kings. The government is proving unable to address that emergency with Sikorsky. It needs to get tough with Sikorsky. It will not have any strong negotiating position with Sikorsky unless it's prepared to contemplate ripping up the contract and going for an alternative off-the-shelf, readily available helicopter. So we feel it's time that the Government of Canada, as it has done with the F-35 procurement, immediately begin to consider other options, to develop urgently a plan B.
Systemic problem here, which seems to be defense officials kind of lowball estimates, or they kind of, jig their bid in a way to kind of misrepresent, it seems anyway, to misrepresent what they're looking for or what their needs are. And then we end up in this situation over and over again.
Well, you're right that we end up in this situation over and over again. And I think the answer to the problem is much more stringent oversight by elected politicians over the Department of National Defence, not just at the initial approval stage, but at every stage of the procurement moving forward. And we haven't seen that on this file. We saw problems with the F-35s. We've got problems with the fixed-wing search and rescue aircraft procurement. What is happening is an initial approved procurement, and then DND adding bells and whistles on, which are post-approval, but add expense, add complexity, and in the case of the Cyclone, have necessitated an entire re-engineering of the aircraft. So this is partly a failure of DND and partly a failure of their political masters. And this particular file, the maritime helicopter file, is one that cries out for much closer scrutiny. And I'm surprised that Mr. MacKay has not been much firmer on this issue. This is a huge issue for Canadians on the east and the west coast, for our Navy. We all know about the Sea Kings. We know it's grossly unacceptable that the men and women of the Canadian Forces are still reliant on Sea Kings. And yet for 7 years, we've had this gross incompetence and I would almost say malpractice on the part of the Department of National Defence.
Hold some of those defense officials responsible, or should some of them face some sort of penalty or consequence? Is that the way to kind of get this issue addressed in the future?
Well, our first recommendation is that the government provide full transparency on this procurement. And I can't really answer the question as to who individually might be responsible without that full transparency. I should also say, though, that our concern, Stuart Webb's concern and my concern, is not so much to look back and assign blame, is to help the government find a solution to this crisis. And it is a crisis. Again, the Sea Kings are 50 years old. So the answer here is to recognize that the current approach of allowing DND to essentially run with this on its own is unacceptable. They just keep digging themselves into a deeper hole here. New requirements, new additional costs, reported renegotiations of contracts, but from the weakest possible negotiating position. Someone, the Department of National Defense or the Prime Minister, needs to step in and say enough is enough. Sikorsky, we've got to sort it out fast, and if you're not able to do that, we will go for another helicopter. And here are the 4 alternatives we're going to look at in the next 2 months. One is that it's important to underline that none of our allies has chosen the Cyclone. Canada is the first and only buyer of the CH-148. This says 2 things. First of all, it says that other countries have concluded this is not a good helicopter. We are buying a helicopter that has been rejected by other countries. They are choosing the Eurocopter. They are choosing the NH-90. They're choosing the AW101. They're choosing the Seahawk. They're not choosing the Cyclone. Now that says something I think quite powerful about the scope of this mistake. The second related thing to that is that we're not going to get the economic benefits from this procurement that might have been expected had other countries chosen to buy the Cyclone. The Canadian companies who would be subcontracted by Sikorsky to build parts for the Cyclone are not going to get any additional work for overseas sales. So we're pouring, at the moment, at least $5.7 billion. That's Auditor General Sheila Fraser, her number in 2010 for this, twice the original, $5.7 billion into this investment with no return realistically expected from overseas sales. So that's just another angle on the incompetence here. With defense procurement, part of the calculation is how do you generate sustained economic activity in this country? And the Cyclone procurement is an example of how precisely not to do that. There will not be a significant economic boost for Canada here. No one else is buying this helicopter. We've bought a pig in the poke, and other countries, they've seen it, they've recognized our mistake, and they're going elsewhere. Emphasize that our concerns about the Seahawk relate to the fact that it is a helicopter adapted from a helicopter, the Black Hawk, that was designed for use on land. And there is some uncertainty, and has been some uncertainty, as to its flotation capability, because it was not designed initially as a naval helicopter. And as Stuart just pointed out, the fact that the U.S. Navy has opted for the Seahawk and has been flying it in significant numbers for decades suggests that this concern about flotation may not be a serious consideration. And therefore, we feel the Seahawk should be very seriously considered. And as Stuart also said, if the government of Canada were to get tough with Sikorsky and have some serious negotiations, one possible option at the end of those negotiations would be to transfer the current contract for Sikorsky Cyclones into a contract for Sikorsky Seahawks, thus enabling both parties to save face and quite possibly to save significant cost.